What's good, First Church? Welcome to church. It's a great day to be here with you. And I want to welcome Hebron online, Jasper County Jail, and DeMont Wheatfield. And Hebron, I got to tell you guys, we're proud of you. You're killing it. There's a bunch of great stuff happening there. We got so many new exciting things going on. But hey, if you are coming from the north or you're geographically closer to Hebron, I'd encourage you to check that location out. Our elder evaluators always say it beats us here at DeMont Wheatfield. But I know this is spring break weekend, so we're a little sparser, but we're getting full, and it would be awesome if people from that direction wanted to check out Hebron. It's a great place. I hope you guys had a great week. I sure did. I've been doing the workout I always do, which is it's called Insanity Max 30. I like it. But my wife is like, that's a sissy workout. You should do a real workout. Come with me to the gym. And I'm like, I'm in great shape. I'll go to the gym. Yesterday, I did a workout with her, and I can barely move today. It's terrible. There's a lady named Anissa there. She's a trainer, and she wrecked my life. And somebody in the lobby said, John, you're walking like a president. And I said, stop. That's mean and not appropriate. But anyway, if you see me walking funny, that's why. Not because my pants are too tight, which they are, but that's not the problem. Okay? That's why I'm working out. But we're continuing our series called Our Road to the Cross. And we're talking about how Jesus got to the cross. Last week, I asked you, would you leave the boat of your dreams to follow Jesus? And the disciples had that very question. You know, would you leave the literal boat of your dreams full of fish to follow Jesus? And they recognized that, hey, my dreams are just going to become a boat full of dead fish, but Jesus holds the keys to life. So they left at once to follow Jesus, and they follow him for about 3 years. And at first they think it's awesome. I mean, they're following Jesus. It's going great. Everything's going well. Jesus is attracting huge crowds. The movement's growing. He's doing miracles. And he's even empowering them to do miracles, which is super cool. I mean, it's really powerful. But about 18 months in, the disciples get a little restless. And I think that's often the case for people new to faith, new to God. About 18 months in, you start to get a little restless. You're like, hey, God, what's going on? And the disciples were wondering why Jesus wasn't doing more in their lives and with his fame. You see, the Jews believed, because the Bible said, that a new king would rise up and create a new world order for the Jews. They called him, in Jewish tradition, the Messiah. And the Messiah was this figure who was going to fix all the fundamental issues that the Jews were facing. Sort of like Iron Man, but for Jewish people. You know what I mean? Like, here's what Jesus was going to be. That's what they believed. That's what they believed, is Jesus was going to come and fix their problems. Now, the disciples were following Jesus because they thought he was going to be their Iron Man, their Messiah. They'd been conquered by the Romans, and the Jews wanted to be free, obviously, from being conquered by the Romans and other empires. And the disciples were believing and hoping that Jesus was the Messiah. But as time went on, they were getting increasingly impatient and frustrated because Jesus was playing coy about whether or not he was the Messiah. He had all this fame. He's doing all these miracles. He's fulfilling all these prophecies, but he's not doing it the way they want him to. He's not stepping up into his role. And I don't know if you've ever been impatient for God to do something you think he should do in your life, but the disciples were that way. In Matthew chapter 16, the disciples are outside of Caesarea Philippi, this big city. And Peter outright tells Jesus that he's the Messiah. You can see it right here. It says, Simon Peter answered, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus, you are the Messiah. And Jesus is like, yeah, you're right, you're correct. It's the first time he admitted it. And the disciples are like, yes, they're pumped, they're excited. They're like, let's go, this is amazing. Jesus is the Messiah. But then he sternly warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. And at this, their jaws hit the floor. They're like, Jesus, we just don't understand. What's wrong with you? Why would a good God not come into the world that he made and just like rip open the sky, tell everybody, hey, I'm here. Why won't you do it our way? Jesus, what you're doing doesn't make sense. And this is key. They disagree with the way God is doing things. Have you ever felt that way? In your life, okay, I believe God's real and whatever else, but I kind of just disagree with the way that he does stuff. I don't like the way he's doing something. You ever felt that way? That's a feeling I get a lot. Have you ever looked at God, your boss, and you just wonder, why would you do it that way? It just doesn't make sense. It'd be so much easier to do it my way. Why would God not just show everybody, supernaturally rip open the sky and I'm God and believe in me or perish? That would make sense. That's exactly what the disciples felt. They left a boatload of dreams to follow Jesus, and God was not doing it their way. And they followed God for a long time, and he was doing good for a little bit. But then for them, their faith, their walk beside Jesus, literally and figuratively, starts to get a little stale. Have you ever had that? Things with God are kind of getting a little stale, same, whatever. They start getting irritated with Jesus. He did a lot of great stuff, but there was a lot that he did that they didn't understand, and they were frustrated. They're frustrated with God. And as you read the biographies of Jesus' life, it's the first 4 books of the new part of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the biographies of his life. You'll see that after Matthew chapter 16, the disciples' demeanor towards Jesus begins to change. They bicker more with each other. They become more testy. They start pushing Jesus more. They're frustrated because they want Jesus to claim his throne as Messiah, but he's not doing it their way. And I remember going to great college, Wheaton College, specifically for my first 3 years there. I love the school. It was a genuinely authentic Christian community. I liked it. You had to sign a lifestyle agreement to go there, though. They called it the Community Covenant. And it drove me nuts that there were some kids who broke the Community Covenant. And I'm like, you guys signed this in the first place. There's a squillion other schools you could have thrown your money at and gone to, but you chose to come here and you signed this agreement with your name. Where's your integrity? It made me mad. I was mad. I mean, some kids, horror of horrors, they would let girls on a guys-only dorm floor sometimes, sneak them in. It's like, what's wrong with you? How could you? Some kids, this is terrible, they would stay out past curfew. And I'd look at them and be like, what is wrong with you? How could you? Some kids, and this is bad, and I heard rumors of this, that this happened. I never actually saw it, but I heard rumors that some kids would drink what a Baptist boy calls the devil's juice, also known as alcohol. And I was like, oh, how could you? It's an atrocity. It made me mad, it really did. And I hated these kids for agreeing with their word to come to the school, signing this agreement, and then breaking it. I thought, I don't want to be friends with you. I mean, what's wrong with you? Why would you do this? And I thought, why would God not bring justice down on them? They're ruining the culture. They were breaking their word, and I was kind of mad at them and mad at God. And I think that's a lot of us, in different ways. I mean, not all of you are, as hoity-toity as I was at that time, but the hardest part about faith is you meet God, and at first, he's this amazing, superpower. You see miracles around every corner, and you just wonder how you ever lived without him. You're on fire. But then you leave your boats and your nets to follow him, and a couple years in, things are just not happening. Progress has stopped. Maybe your prayers aren't being answered. Your heart feels empty. And of course, you can't go back to not believing. I mean, once you see the evidence, something doesn't come from nothing. And once you understand, okay, God makes sense. I mean, it's pretty easy to believe in him. You can't close that box once you've opened it. But sometimes God's just not doing things the way that you want him to. And you're frustrated. And he's definitely not doing it at the speed that you want him to do it at. It's like, God, move along here. I mean, when am I going to meet my spouse? When am I going to have a baby? When is this thing? You're frustrated. You're angry. If you've ever been impatient with God to do something in your life, even if you're not a Christian, and you've wondered why you don't do things differently, this message is for you. What we're going to do is look at some Bible, and then I'm going to make a point. This is a 1-point message. I know, super, super simple. Okay, this is easy. In Minnesota, I was raised Baptist. We would call Baptists always do 3-point messages. A 1-pointer, we call that a Lutheran message. Simple, easy, but that's mean. For the disciples of Jesus, they had his 12 closest friends, right? Those are the disciples of Jesus, and they were frustrated with God at Palm Sunday. And that's what Palm Sunday is sort of about. The disciples have been pushing Jesus to do more, to move more quickly, and it's a sentiment I relate to. I'm always impatient with God. God, you got to move more quickly. The problem is Jesus has been hanging around Galilee for a long time. Galilee's up here. This is the Sea of Galilee. And down here is Jerusalem. And they want Jesus to go to Jerusalem because it's the seat of power. And they want Jesus to kick the Romans out and claim his role as Messiah. But he won't do it. And finally, they receive word their friend Lazarus is sick. Now, Lazarus, here's Jerusalem, right, trying to weatherman it, okay? And Lazarus lives in Bethany, right there. It's about 2 miles from Jerusalem. It's a suburb of Jerusalem. And the disciples hear that Lazarus is sick. Jesus loves Lazarus, cares about him, and they're like, let's go. They're not excited that Lazarus is sick, but they're excited that Jesus' hand has been forced. He's gonna have to go to Bethany to heal Lazarus right outside of Jerusalem. But to their surprise, Jesus dilly-dallies. He does. He don't want to go. You ever had somebody in your life, they won't say no, but they just kind of ignore, they ignore the problem, and you're like, hello, this is a problem, whatever it is, you got to file your taxes. April 15th is coming. I don't understand. Whatever the thing. Jesus, he just ignores the problem for a little bit. And I think it's because he doesn't want to go to Jerusalem. He knows he's going to die there. He knows it's going to be terrible and painful and awful. And the disciples are anxious because their friend is sick. And at first they're excited. Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem and whatever. He's going to heal Lazarus and he's going to be the Messiah and whatever else. Now they're getting nervous. They're like, Jesus, we're going to run out of time. So eventually they go. They go to Jerusalem and they get there and they get word that Lazarus has died. In fact, he's been dead for 3 days. And everybody is irritated with Jesus. Lazarus' siblings, they're some of his best friends, Jesus' best friends, Martha and Mary, and they're mad at Jesus. Where were you? Because Jesus delayed, it would have been simple for him to heal Lazarus. They saw Jesus heal lots of people. Jesus healed people like a boss. That's what he did. It would have been trivial to heal Lazarus, but he doesn't do it. He gets there, it's too late. Everybody's frustrated, it's angry. You ever been at a family gathering, but everybody's mad at everybody, something bad happened. That's kind of what this is, everybody's angry. John 11, verse 33 says, he was deeply troubled. Jesus was irritated. Where have you put him? He asked. They told him, Lord, come and see. Come see his tomb. He's been buried. And then it says in verse 35, shortest verse in the Bible, then Jesus wept. Why was Jesus weeping if he knew in literally a few minutes he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead? Why does it say he was deeply troubled? Jesus has seen beyond death. Later it says that he was angry. Angry. I think it's because he knows that this miracle is going to force his hand. He's going to raise Lazarus from the grave right outside of Jerusalem, and at that point, everybody is going to go crazy. And he dreads raising Lazarus from the grave because it will set about a course of events that will lead to his crucifixion. But he does it anyway. He raises a man that's been dead for 3 days because he loves him, And the crowd goes wild, as expected. The crowd goes wild. Everybody, let's go. Jesus is amazing. Look what he did. Oh, my goodness. Thousands gather around Jesus outside of Jerusalem. The hubbub is there. It's only a 2-mile walk from behind the Mount of Olives, from Bethany into Jerusalem. And Jesus knows he can't avoid the mantle of Messiah any longer. And he's frustrated. We know from his prayers later on, if you're familiar with it, Jesus, right before he's crucified in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, Lord, if there's any other way, take this cup of suffering from me, but not my will, but yours be done. He's reluctant to go to the cross, and he's still reluctant. Nevertheless, he takes up his mantle. He decides to go to Bethany to raise Lazarus. He does it. And I used to think that Palm Sunday, Jesus rides into Jerusalem. There's this big parade of people. Everybody's waving the palm branches because they're excited that Jesus is coming. I used to think that Jesus just sort of had this impromptu parade that happened. Just impromptu, and Jesus was kind of like, shucks, guys, like, stop. I'm embarrassed, kind of blushing. Isn't that how you imagine Jesus riding in on the donkey, like a little bit embarrassed? That's not true at all, though. He orchestrates it. He leads it. First of all, what king rides on a donkey? Isn't that weird? Pancho Villa rides a donkey. You know what I mean? Like the king does it. A king rides a war horse, a white steed, a charger. You're like, what is Jesus doing? Well, in Isaiah, they say that the Messiah will come into Jerusalem riding a donkey's colt. And Jesus orchestrates that. He sets that up. And I think, really, the raising of Lazarus is when Jesus starts setting up the parade. I'll prove it to you. Check this out. Matthew 20, verse 30, it says, 2 blind men were sitting beside the road. And when they heard that Jesus was coming that way, question, how did they hear that Jesus was coming that way? How did they hear? Well, it's because this big crowd from Bethany was walking ahead of Jesus. And they're all talking about how Jesus raised Lazarus from the grave. It was very exciting. It was a big deal. Jesus raised Lazarus from the grave. Oh my goodness, did you hear? And here he comes, whatever. And these blind guys, they can't see anything. That's why they're blind. That's why they're called blind. They hear, wow, Jesus is coming. There's this big crowd. What's going on? This is the beginnings of a parade. Now, they're not in a fever pitch yet. They haven't turned into a parade fever pitch yet, but here's what happens, okay? The blind men shout, Lord, this is critical, Son of David, have mercy on us. Now that doesn't make sense to us. We're like, Son of David, who cares? Not a big deal. But for them, it's a big deal. Son of David was a specific title reserved for the Messiah. It's like saying Jesus is Iron Man, a man descended from the king's line of David. It's the line of people that the Bible says the Messiah will come from, David's line. It's a big deal. Up to this point, Jesus has been calling himself Son of Man. That's a generic title, Son of Man. And what it does is it leaves his lineage in question. It's a generic title. It's just a generic title that, he's being unclear about who he is. He's playing coy. So up until this point, whenever anybody called Jesus the Messiah or Son of David, Jesus had told them to be silent. He said, shh, don't tell anyone, right? He told the disciples sternly, don't tell anyone I'm the Messiah. But here in front of thousands of people, there's some blind men, most humble of humble people, proclaiming that Jesus is the Son of David publicly. And everybody's waiting on bated breath for Jesus to see how he responds to this. You know that scene in Iron Man 1, the only really good Iron Man movie? Iron Man 1, Tony Stark is in front of, same thing, just kidding, very different. But Tony Stark is in front of a bunch of reporters, right? And they're all asking questions about the Iron Man suit. Did you build it? Did you whatever? And he pulls off his sunglasses and he says, I am Iron Man. And the whole room is like, whoa, he just admitted it. That's what's about to happen right here, okay? The blind men say, Son of David, and they're waiting to see if Jesus corrects them, and he doesn't correct them. Instead, he opens the eyes of the blind. He heals them. He does a miracle, right? To vindicate his authority as Messiah. And the crowd goes wild. Same thing. You know, it's like all the reporters in there, he's Iron Man. He's the Messiah. And this is where the parade starts. Jesus orchestrates his own parade. You wonder why everybody's so excited about Jesus coming in? Because he raised Lazarus from the grave. Everybody's following him. Then he opens the eyes of the blind and does not correct them when they call him Son of David. He's the Messiah. And so they start chanting, save us. Hosanna, which means save us. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Son of David, Messiah. It's Palm Sunday. It's the parade. And then he spends the first 7 verses of Matthew 21 literally orchestrating his parade. Right? He says, go into town, get me a donkey's colt. I'm going to ride it. If they ask you, why are you taking my colt? Why are you taking my car? Say, the Lord needs it. He calls himself the Lord. He calls himself Messiah. He's declaring it's a big deal. And this is, the disciples are assuming, the big moment. There's an old song. At the start of it, this great poet says, if you had one shot, one opportunity to capture everything you ever wanted, would you capture it or just let it slip? That's what the disciples are hearing. They're like, Jesus, you better lose yourself in this moment right now. This is the moment Jesus is going to assume power, but he does not do it. He lets the crowd disperse. Big parade into Jerusalem, lets the crowd disperse. And the disciples are flabbergasted. Their jaws hit the floor. Jesus, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? And here's why. We don't understand this. Our Constitution, we have a constitutional right to assemble, right? We have this right to assemble. And today, it's not as important as it was back then. Back in the day, they did not have the weapons we have today, right? You can use an army to disperse a crowd today. Back in the day, they didn't have bullets and guns, right? You couldn't disperse a crowd. There was power in a crowd. A crowd could topple a government. That's why we have the constitutional right to assemble. But Jesus lets the crowd dissipate. He does not walk to the Capitol building and take power. He does not unseat the Jewish and Roman leaders. He challenges them with grace and mercy later on, but after the crowd has dispersed. He leaves his position of strength and power. And once again, the disciples are like, Jesus, what is wrong with you? Do you have any idea what you're doing, Jesus? Are you clueless? Do you not get, you rode into town on a donkey's colt to fulfill the prophecy? You allowed the blind man to call you Son of David? And then you arrange this huge crowd, and you let it all go. And they're gutted. What's wrong with you, Jesus? We left our boats. We did all this stuff. We gave you everything. Have you ever been there? You give up everything to follow Jesus. You're doing all this stuff. You trust him with your life. You assume he's going to let your life turn out. You're obedient. You don't party. You do all these things. You follow God, and you're like, now give me a spouse. Now give me a house. Now give me this thing that I want. What's wrong with you? I put the quarter in. I get my pop can. Where is it, Jesus? Curiously, right before this, immediately before he heals the blind man, he's having a discussion with the disciples. They're telling him, you should be king, you should be king. And Jesus gives him a little hint. This is a big hint. If you miss this, you kind of miss a big part of Palm Sunday. But Jesus says, as he's orchestrating the parade, after he raised Lazarus from the grave, Jesus says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many. A curious thing for a king to say. I'm here as a servant. He's acting like a king, but he calls himself a servant. What's going on? This is what makes the disciples so angry. This dichotomy is what makes them angry, and it's what confuses a lot of us about God today too. Is Jesus a holy, powerful king, or is he a suffering servant? Some of you might be familiar with both of these terms. Here's my big point today. This is one big point, one point message, like I said. And this is the big point. If you're frustrated with God, this point will change your life. I'll explain it. At first, it's not going to. At first, you're going to be like, but then you're going to be like, that's good, okay? Here's my big point. Jesus is both king and servant. He's both. He's both a servant and a king. And this is what the disciples just cannot understand about Jesus. And I think this is what causes many of us to be frustrated with Jesus. You need to understand, Jesus is perfectly okay with impossible dichotomies. He exists beyond and outside of our universe where more than all things are possible. Jesus can do it. He can be all-knowing and sovereign and yet afford people choices. How's that possible? He can. Here's one we say all the time. Jesus is fully God and fully human. What? How's that possible? How can that be? How can it be both? And here's the one that most of us don't get that is probably most important and relevant to us today. He can be king and he can also be a servant. And I think this dichotomy is why so many people are frustrated with Jesus. The disciples wanted him to be a king, but he insisted on also being a servant, on washing their feet, on healing beggars, on caring for the least of these. It's like Jesus, a king, doesn't care for the least of these. A king rules a kingdom. And I'm here to tell you today that Jesus is both king and servant. That's the lesson of Palm Sunday. And if you don't get this, you're going to be irritated with God, just like the disciples. This is the reason why so many people, you follow Jesus for 3 to 5 years, and then you just kind of drift off. Because you don't understand why Jesus is both of these things. We tend to assume, I shouldn't say always, my wife has talked to me about using superlative. She says it frustrates her when we're arguing. I say, I never use superlatives. Okay, we always tend towards one side or the other. Some people think that Jesus is mostly king, but not servant. Wide shot, there we go. Jesus is king, but not servant. And if you think that, it's destructive to your relationship with God and others. Some people think that Jesus is mostly servant, but not king. And if you think that, it's going to be frustrating to you. I want to talk about both of these extremes. If you live like Jesus is king, but not servant, some things will happen to you. First off, you're going to view God as someone who came to rule and dominate. And you, like so many of the disciples, will be frustrated with God in your life. You'll be frustrated with people in your life, with the way Jesus cares for children and the least of these. That won't be something that you care about. You'll be concerned about the holiness of God. When the blind men were crying out for Jesus to heal him, how did people respond? In verse 31, it says, "Be quiet!" The crowd yelled at them. "Be quiet! Be quiet!" Why were they saying that? Well, they were frustrated that Jesus was taking time to heal some lowly blind beggars. What's wrong with you, Jesus? Why are you taking the time to do this? Specifically, who was frustrated? Peter, the disciple Peter, was frustrated because Peter has a unique tendency to see Jesus as king only. When you read the Bible, watch for this. Peter was angry when Jesus would take time to heal people. Jesus, what's wrong with you? Because Peter thought that Jesus was more important. He was about more important things. He was a king, not a servant in Peter's eyes. Peter said, Jesus, you don't have time to heal these silly kids. And Jesus said, let the little children come unto me, Peter, and do not hinder them. And Peter would say, Jesus, you can't wash my feet. You're a king, not a servant. I'll wash your feet. And Jesus said, no, I tell you the truth. Unless you let me wash your feet, you can have no part of me. And Peter said at Caesarea Philippi, Jesus, you're the Messiah. You can't die. You can't serve others like that. And what did Jesus say? Get behind me, Satan. Woo, harsh rebuke. Peter said, Jesus, they're going to arrest you in the Garden of Gethsemane. You're a king. I'll go cut their ears off. And Jesus said, whoa, calm down. No, I'm also a servant. Peter was always excited when Jesus acted like a king and angry when Jesus acted like a servant. And people who view Jesus as king but not servant, they will tend to be legalistic and pharisaical. And they'll turn church into a place where no one's perfect and no one is welcome. We can't approach God. He's a holy God. We can't approach him. We cannot look full in his wonderful face. He'll obliterate you because he's king, he's holy king, and nobody's good enough, and you can't approach God in his holiness. God as king but not servant will make you mad at people, mad at yourself. That's what will happen. That's the end result in your life. Then there are people who view God as servant but not king. This is also destructive to your view of God. This might be a stretch to some, but there is one disciple who I think views Jesus this way. I think it's Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot, he's the one that would betray Jesus. And I think of the two perspectives, this is perhaps the more destructive one. Check out Judas right after he raised Lazarus from the grave. It says, then Mary, okay, so I forgot to mention this, but in Jewish tradition, after somebody raises you from the grave, it was customary to have a banquet for them to thank them for raising you from the dead. It's a joke because it didn't happen very often. But anyway, then Mary, the sister of Lazarus, took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from the essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance, okay, perfume, extremely expensive, lavishly expensive. It was like a $60,000 bottle of perfume. If you were at Sisterhood, you'll know all about it. But Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would soon betray him, said, that perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and given to the poor. Why is Judas frustrated when Mary does this? Because this lavish act was an act reserved for a king. You would only do that for a king. And in Judas's mind, it's like, Jesus, you're a teacher. You're not a king. You're being arrogant. Perfume is so expensive, and Jesus is a servant. He's a teacher to Judas. He's not a king, and it's a waste. Why would he waste that kind of money? Jesus is arrogant. God thinks he's too good. He's here to serve me. And people who view Jesus as king only will hate people and love God. But people who view Jesus as a servant, they will love people, but they will hate God. King-only people, what do they say? They say, church is a place where no one's perfect and no one's welcome. Servant-only people, they say, everyone's perfect and everyone is welcome. They love people and they ignore God's holiness, and they sadly never call people to turn from sin. And ultimately, that's unloving because sin is destructive. And I think this dichotomy is the true struggle of the church today. We have some churches that are king-only churches. King-only churches. They're mean. They're legalistic. They're hateful to people. No one can have a relationship with God because nobody's good enough. Nobody's good enough. I mean, you go there and you're not good, and you can't come, and whatever. And if you've been a person like this, you know how it feels. I've been a person like this, especially during my time at Wheaton. You hate everyone, including yourself. In churches that act like this, you end up being like, well, we're the only one who gets it. I mean, we're the only one who takes this thing seriously. I mean, this specific act, we're the only one who does it, and we get it right, and everybody else gets it wrong, and whatever, and it's not good. And then there's servant-only churches and people. They're super nice to everybody as everybody perishes and suffers and deals with hurtful sin. But we don't call people to turn from destructive sin because who is God to challenge us? Everybody's perfect, just the way that they are. Unique individual snowflake, there's nothing wrong, and he's just here to serve us. And if you have ever been a person like this, you know that in the end, this is destructive too. You act super nice, but you start to wonder, what's the point of all this? Why are we even doing this? Church becomes purposeless. It's like, why worship God? God's here to worship me. Why bother? Why do I need to go to a building to believe in God? He's here to serve me. He can rub my feet at home. He can forgive my sins at home. What's the big deal? I mean, why worship God if he's just a servant? Then there's that thin golden path right in between with God as servant and king, where he loves us and he's holy, where he's righteous and just, but merciful and full of grace. And in this perfect balance, no one's perfect, but everybody is welcome because we serve the God of second chances. And this is what the disciples had such a difficult time getting. They could see him as either or, but they could not see him as both servant and king. And 2,000 years later, I think we're still dealing with staying on that narrow golden path. The vast majority of Christians are frustrated with God. Some of us say, why does he not just rip open the sky and demand that we kneel before him? Well, because he's not just a king, he's also a servant. Some say, why does he not just let everybody into heaven just the way that we are? Because he's not just a servant, he's also a king. And if you're angry at God about something in your life because you don't understand why he didn't answer my prayer, he didn't give me the desire of my life, he didn't heal my ailment, he didn't give me a child, he didn't provide the service that I demanded of him, what type of person does those things? A servant. Could it be that you view God as a servant, but you forgot that he is also a sovereign king? Some of you, you're angry with people because you just don't understand how wicked they are and how they're ruining the country. I hear that one a lot. They're ruining the country. They're terrible. Their choices are terrible. They're awful people. Could it be that you view God as king, but you also forgot that he is a suffering servant full of mercy and grace and second chances? This was the root of the disciples' frustration with Jesus. And I think this is the root of many of our own issues with God. If there were a spectrum of Jesus as king versus servant, where would you place yourself on this spectrum? Do you have a high view of God or a high view of people and a low view of God? For servant and king, where would you place yourself? Understanding this is key to understanding where your frustrations with God and people come from. If you've been following God for a while and your faith is not progressing and you're not feeling great about your faith, you're right where the disciples were on Palm Sunday. That's Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday is the ultimate expression for the disciples of a frustration with God. If you tend to look at church and you think this is a nice place to get a little bit better at life, pastor comes, gives a good message, gives us a little challenge, throws us a nice little, and it's like, wow, that was good. I'm going to change. I'm going to get a little bit better. God is your servant. And eventually you'll drift away. You won't get mad, that mad. You just, it's not that big a deal. Why do I come? It's fine. It's whatever. I'll go when I have time. If you look at people and you think we're so messed up, they shouldn't be here and they shouldn't be here and it's going to hell in a handbasket, God's our king. But maybe he's not your servant. But if you look at the world and think we're desperate and we're wicked, but we're saved by grace through faith in Christ alone, and I'm humble and thankful I don't deserve it, but I receive it, and I want others to know about it, God is your king, and he's also the suffering servant. And I think about a king servant like Jesus. It's wonderful. And there's so much of it that we love. I mean, he will serve us. He'll die for us. But here's the big thing you need to understand about our suffering servant is he's going to do it his way because he's also king. And I think there's a lot of people, you look at the cross and you just think, that's a convoluted way to do it, God. I mean, that's weird. We come to Easter and whatever, and I get something doesn't come from nothing. I see the archaeological and historical evidence, and it all, like, I can't not believe in you, but I mean, the cross really Christ. Be thankful that he served you. Be thankful that you receive the grace, and understand that as king, he is going to do it his way, and that his way will prove to be the best way. I want to go back to my Wheaton College shenanigans. I think my problem was that for some reason, despite knowing God's grace, I viewed God as a king only, but not a loving servant. And I love God, but for a season, I hated people. My time at Wheaton was one of the only times in my Christian life where I did not share my faith and win any souls. It was also one of the most dry and unfulfilling spiritual times of my life. I think the biggest mark of that time for me was my frustration with God and my frustration with people. Because God was not acting like a king in my mind. I was off balance because my perception of God, I saw him as a king, but not a servant. So I'll ask you one more time. How do you view God? As king, as servant, or as both? I want us walking into Holy Week to have a healthy view of God. I think there's many of us, Holy Week is confusing. If your view of God is not the way that God describes himself as servant and king, Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many. But he's also a conquering Messiah, rides into Jerusalem with power and dignity. If you do not have a healthy view of God that is both, I want you to fix it today. And I have some solutions for you. If you view God as a king, but not a servant, here's what you need to do. You need to pray for your enemies. You need to bless those who curse you. I want to challenge you to pray each day this week and ask God for compassion and perspective on his love for them and also the grace he has given to you. This is one of the big deals, is a lot of times, if we've not received grace from God, we can't give it to others. And sometimes that's because we haven't really recognized that we are sinful and we need God's grace. Sometimes it is because we recognize that we're sinful, but we have chosen not to receive the grace. If you've ever wronged somebody really badly, you say, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. And they say, I forgive you completely, but you still don't receive their forgiveness. You still, I'm so sorry. And they're like, I forgive you. Receive their forgiveness, but you don't. That's how many people who view God as king but not servant live. And you need to receive God's grace. God says, I forgive you. But you don't feel forgiven. You need to receive his forgiveness because you can't give what you don't have. Some of you view God as servant, but not king. And if that's you, your passion's probably waning. Probably a little angry at God. You love people, but you're angry at God. Kind of drifting away. I want to challenge you to get serious about honoring Jesus as king. Whatever the issue is, the issue of rebellion in your life, I want you to understand God isn't just a servant here to serve us. He is a holy and righteous and just king. Ask him for grace, and turn from that sin. If it's drinking, stop drinking. If it's porn, get parental controls on your phone and stop it. If it's gossiping or flirting in a way that doesn't honor God, I flirt with my wife, but confess it and stop it. If it's sexual sin, move out and break up. Or if, and only if it's a godly relationship, godly match, get married. Honoring God as king will give you a much deeper love for God. It will bless your life because Jesus is both king and servant. The disciples were frustrated with God on Palm Sunday because of the way that Jesus was doing it, but he chose the cross. He didn't do it their way. You would think that the disciples wanted him to take over the Roman Empire. Thank God he didn't, because he established a kingdom that would last forever, a kingdom and a movement that was much greater because he did it his way, a hegemony that would span the entire globe because he chose the cross as a king and a servant. And church became a place where no one's perfect and everyone's welcome. In the grace of God, and the power of God, and the majesty of God. That's what church is. And that's what Easter is. And I can't wait to celebrate Jesus with you next Sunday at Easter, the most important Sunday of the year for Christians. It's a huge deal. As we close, I want to ask you to stand to your feet. And I'd like to just have a prayer to prepare our hearts for next Sunday. God in heaven, we thank you for your grace and your power, for your justice and your mercy. You are king, and you are the suffering servant, Lord. As king, you place yourself in the most lowly and humble circumstance to die for us while we were still sinners. And we thank you for that. And God, today we submit to you as king. We receive your grace as a suffering servant. Would you help us to have a healthy perspective of who you are as we walk into the Easter season, Lord? I just ask that As we bless your name next Sunday, our hearts would see you as you truly are, the mighty righteous King who gave us mercy while we were still sinners. We thank you for your grace, your mercy, and your justice. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.